All right, welcome to On the Mic. I'm Jake Killeen, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Rob Cheney. Rob is a golf coach that's coaching out of GOLFTEC in Singapore. He has recently made the Golf Digest Best International Golf Teacher list of 2020, and he uses a somewhat controversial method to teach his students called stack and tilt. So I'm excited to speak to him regarding this and maybe dispel some myths around the teaching and method of stack and tilt. Mate, well, I appreciate you being on with me today. I really appreciate your time.
It's fine, mate. It's good. As much as anything, I like talking golf, and it's nice to have a distraction at the moment from the monotony of getting up, going for a run, coming home, looking at my emails.
Yeah, that's right.
Keep me off social media.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I wanted to talk, obviously, stack and tilt with you.
Yes.
Because I've been a coach for a while now, and stack and tilt's been, there in the background for me, being from Australia for a while. But I was never really, into it in terms of finding out the information until we met each other, obviously, last year. And from there, I got a little bit more of an understanding through yourself and Andy at the seminar. And I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to talk to you about that today. So talk us a little bit about how you got into stack and tilt and where you first found it.
Sure. Yeah. My story was, first and foremost, that I was kind of didn't really understand it at all. And in the very, very beginning, what I'd heard of it, I was pretty negative about, to be honest, which I find quite funny all these years later. But really, my introduction to it was through a guy called James Ridyard, who you may know or may know of. James is now sort of a tour coach, working primarily on short game, works with some of the best players in the world. But James at the time was working for TrackMan. He was one of the first employees of TrackMan, and he was like a representative for them through Europe. And he was sort of selling the unit, going around doing some educational stuff. And it was just by coincidence, really, that we happened to live close together geographically in Bedford, or I was working at a driving range in Bedfordshire in the UK. James lived very close, and there was a few occasions when he came to the driving range and just practiced really by himself. And I saw he had the TrackMan, and it was at a time when Twitter was just starting to kind of take off. And at that time, James was on there as a handle called Golf Swing Rebel. And he'd go on there under a kind of pseudonym and post interesting things and maybe stir the pot a little bit with a few kind of suggestions and arguments, if you like, online. Anyway, I got to know James, and at that time James was sort of the first person to bring Andy and Mike from Stack and Tilt to the UK. So he was really one of the first authorized instructors. There was a handful of other guys involved early at the time, people like Sam Quirk, and there were some other guys across Europe, Javier Nigard, and a few other names. And I'd really not heard of anything, really, other than maybe the negative stuff. And James was good enough to sort of help me out, really. We just spent an hour or two in my teaching room one day at the driving range, and he showed me some of the basic concepts. And from that day almost, I remember thinking, this is something I need to learn more about, because of the simplicity of the fundamentals. Really, it was the breaking down of the basic fundamental skills that golfers need to learn, which made so much sense to me as a teacher, where you struggle to help people maybe over a period of 4, 5, 6 lessons. This made so much sense that I had to find out more.
And the fundamentals you talk about, the three, aren't they? We talk about normally grip, stance, posture, all those things, but stack and tilt simplified even more into 3 different categories. And
correct.
And talk on those 3 categories.
Well, the biggest difference between the stack and tilt fundamentals and golf's more traditional fundamentals is that stack and tilt fundamentals are dynamic. They talk of something that you have to do through motion, but whereas the static fundamentals like grip, posture, ball position are exactly that. They're static. And they're variable. I mean, if you studied the game for any length of time, you don't even have to study the game. If you just look at the PGA Tour, you notice some people aim to the left, some people aim to the right, different grips. There's a lot of variables. And the idea maybe that you teach, or at least, my education in terms of teaching was through the British PGA. And the idea that you start with this set of core fundamentals where you teach everyone to have a good grip, good posture, good stance, etc., didn't necessarily add up once you understood what really connected great players, and it was their ability to first and foremost control that low point. So once I heard that, and once I sort of realized that, I thought to myself, that's a massive departure from what I probably teach people, and it makes so much sense. Why would you not focus on that piece first? And you don't have to have a perfect grip, whatever a perfect grip is, to control the low point. So it just changed my focus really completely in terms of how you go about helping somebody, and the results that you can have with a student, I found very quickly were much faster than maybe traditional coaching, or my traditional coaching was.
So you talk of low point, you're talking about the club hitting the ground at a particular point. Is that what you mean by low point, right?
Yeah, so the first fundamental would be control the low point, or really control that point on the ground where the club makes contact with the ground, which for an iron shot, most of us would understand you're supposed to be after you've made contact with the ball. So the poorest players are hitting the ground before the ball. Poorest players are not hitting the ground at all with an iron shot. So teaching somebody how to do that, and noticing that feature, if you like, that commonality exists, whether it's Jordan Spieth, whether it's Jim Furyk, whether it's Tiger Woods, whether it's, it doesn't matter which golfer you want to pick. Good golfers do that because that's fundamental to ball striking, and ball striking is fundamental to, number one, hitting the ball far, and number two, hitting the ball with some degree of control in terms of distance, which is another skill which you need to shoot low scores. Low point control means hitting the ground in a similar spot. And of course, when it comes to the driver, you're not hitting the ground, but controlling the bottom of that arc is still important.
Okay, the second one would be curvature, so controlling the curve of the ball.
So the way that they'd list it would be contact first. Number two would be power. And the description of power is twofold. Number one, you need to hit the ball far enough to shorten the golf course. So, for example, if you just took the first fundamental and taught someone to chip the ball, put the weight on their front foot maybe, put their hand slightly ahead of the ball maybe, and then hit down on it slightly and make good contact, most people can do that with a chip shot. But you couldn't play golf like that, because if you only chip the ball 20 meters, you can't shorten the golf course without it taking you 15 shots to reach the green. So you have to control the low point, but while doing so, you have to create enough power to shorten the golf course. So that's really the first take on power. And the second take on power is enough power to play the course. So depending on a golfer's ability, their handicap, their strength, the tees they play off, golfers need to hit the ball different distances. A PGA Tour player needs to hit the ball further than a 20 handicapper. So you don't have to hit the ball as far as you possibly can. You have to hit the ball far enough. And then the third one would be curvature, or controlling the dispersion left and right. So having some degree of ability to keep the ball within a shot cone that's manageable, really.
Yeah, and when I heard these fundamentals, I was a bit like you. I was like, wow, that really is to the core of what we need to be starting with our students, and if you're wanting to play the game, that's exactly where you need to start. So as soon as I heard those, I was in. Like, I was, okay, let's hear some more about this. So that's the first thing that triggered me, and I was really impressed with that. And basically, if someone was listening at home to us now, how would you define it, or how would you describe stack and tilt in a sentence or two, just so they can get a grip of what it is?
It's a system for playing golf. It's a system for playing, excuse me. It's a system for playing and teaching golf, actually. And it's really built around a three-dimensional description of the swing. They're explaining how the body would move in order to achieve these particular fundamentals. But it's a system that has multiple answers to the infinite number of questions a golfer might present you with. As a coach, you don't know who's going to walk through your door. You don't know what they're going to present you with. You need to have a toolbox, which is fairly vast, really. And you need to be able to dig deep and figure out lots of different solutions. And that's what this system enables a coach to do, very well. And the more time you spend around it, the more you realize that's the case. So it's a system for playing golf and a system for teaching golf, which I think is a great thing to have. It's helped my coaching tremendously.
Yeah. How long have you been coaching with it now?
Well, I think I first got introduced to James around 2010. So about 10 years. So, and I've been very fortunate, fortunate in the sense that, James was geographically close, and then you take advantage of some things that come your way. And, helped Andy a lot in recent years while I was still in Europe, delivering the teaching program, helping to kind of put together different events that we taught at, and just being able to hang around someone like Andy as much as that has been a massive benefit to my personal development and my coaching.
Yeah, it is complicated in terms of learning the system if you're a coach. And I think anything that's substantial and good is complicated. But then it's obviously up to the coach to digest it and at an expert level, display that to their student in a way that's simple and effective.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think a lot of if you're talking coaches, first of all, their exposure to stack and tilt in the beginning will always obviously be a limited amount, won't it? No matter how much you try and read up and research on something, once you finally kind of take a step into the training and begin to learn it, you're not going to understand it all in a day or two. That's just the nature of any worthwhile endeavor. It takes time to develop your skills, your knowledge, and then your ability to translate that understanding into something useful on the lesson tee. I certainly remember that from my point of view when I was first getting into this. It was like, wow, this is fantastic. I like the logic. I love the systematic approach. But standing on the lesson tee, turning that information into something useful for the golfer took time as well. It's, and sometimes you don't have an answer for a student, and that sort of sends you back to the bottom of the ladder again, and you start working your way back through and asking better questions and figuring out what it is. But I think that's true of any teaching system that coaches adopt. You have to have a good a toolbox and an adequate number of answers for students, regardless of whatever you're subscribing to, whatever teaching system is in your head. You've got a limited number of answers, and I guess I've always wanted to make sure I've got enough answers to help someone in front of me. And whenever I've realized I don't have an answer, I'll go looking for it, I'll figure it out, or someone will help me figure it out.
Yeah, it helped me a lot, especially for beginner golfers more than anything. I actually realized I had a model that I used in my head, but I felt in the beginner they don't necessarily, especially if they didn't come from any other sports and they were first into golf without having maybe the coordination. If I didn't have the player that was sort of coordinated enough, my model, seemed to be a little bit flawed that way. But I felt with stack and tilt, using that methodology around beginners, especially that didn't play sports before, really helped their progression and a lot quicker for my experience in my short time with it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair and something that you hear a lot, because the basic movements, the very basic introduction to stack and tilt is just that. It's basic and simple. The 10 words are simple. That's one of the things that attracted me as well, was the lowering that barrier to entry for a beginner player. You can have a golfer in the first lesson. I've certainly seen it countless times in my experience personally, and watching other coaches introduce beginners to the game. You can have a beginner hitting the ball 50, 60, 70 yards up in the air in their first lesson, off the grass. We're not teeing this ball up 4 or 5 inches and getting them to just hopefully make contact with one. You can actually get them to really make solid contact in the first lesson. And that's fantastic, because it's that buzz of making good contact and watching the ball fly for a new golfer. It's like, that's the drug, isn't it? That's the bit that brings them back. Absolutely. And if they're standing on your lesson tee for the first hour and maybe the second hour, topping the ball and missing the ball, that's quite demoralizing. And you can lose someone in that time. You haven't got infinite amount of time to make an impression on a student. You need to make an impression quickly. And I think adopting some of the principles of this system would help any coach to do that.
In the past, I've had some that I've let go in terms of not being able to get them quick enough. And that's all part of coaching and learning. But the satisfaction of getting someone from A to B to C and enjoying the game, where they become members of golf clubs and enjoying their pastime as a golfer. There is a bit of pressure on the golf coach. And if you don't understand that as a golf coach, I don't think you care enough. And it's very important to understand that if you get this right early, you could give them 20, 30, 40 years of happiness in the game. Yeah, and it really rests on me, that responsibility.
Yeah, you're right. And you're right as well. We don't get them all right. We don't, and that's not just down to coaching and technical knowledge and ability. There's a human element to it all, isn't there? That sometimes things don't work out,
What I want to do is maybe confirm or dispel a few myths around stack and tilt. Sure. Because it is somewhat controversial, and it feels like it's controversial from people that really don't understand what it is. I feel like the controversy surrounds people that really haven't indulged themselves in what it is. And but some of these myths surround reverse pivoting. That's probably one of the bigger ones. Stack and tilt's reverse pivot, and reverse pivot's no good. So I want you to confirm or deny or dispel this myth.
Sure. It's funny, I was on I'm not sure if you follow Nick Taylor's YouTube channel. Nick works with me here in Singapore.
Yes.
We were on his YouTube channel last night doing a talk for an hour or so on stack and tilt, and this one came up. Like the reverse pivot question is a common one, so I'm glad you brought it up. But my response to that question, first and foremost, is always, what is that person describing when they talk about a reverse pivot? Because I think different people have different connotations and understandings of what it means. I usually find, after talking to people, that the majority of people fall into the idea that it's like you're moving your weight towards the target on the backswing and then away from the target on the downswing. That's what I understand it to be. And again, if it's different, then it would have a different explanation. Stack and tilt certainly isn't that. There's a weight shift in stack and tilt, but it's forwards, right? So the weight stays centered during the backswing and then it moves forward on the downswing, if you're talking about the baseline model. And again, that's a huge conversation and myth to dispel, because just because there's a model doesn't mean that everyone is taught to swing like the model. You don't get a golfer to come into you and say, right, I want to learn this swing. Or if they do, as a coach, the first thing I'm saying to that person is, that's not how this works. Okay, this works under the basis of how are you performing the fundamental tasks. So if there's a deficiency in their ball striking, we'll look at what piece is causing that and attack that piece first. We will not start there and say, well, actually, at P1 at setup, your right foot's only turned out 10 degrees and it needs to be turned out 20 degrees to conform to the model. I mean, that's just nonsense. And if anybody thinks that's what it is, I'd like to dispel that myth. And if anybody goes for a golf lesson and is told by someone trying to teach them stack and tilt that that's what it is, that's not correct either. So it's a system with multiple answers to help golfers. It's not one swing. But if you're talking about the model and understanding the baseline, then it's not a reverse pivot in the sense that the weight moves, like the head doesn't move towards the target on the backswing and then away from the target on the follow through. It's just not what it does.
Yeah, that's the other myth. The other myth is when you get to the top of the swing, the weight hasn't moved back into your right foot. Now, I've seen a few models around and a few tour players that use the model, and it, like anything, there's a discrepancy in exactly what people do. We're all human, we're all different. But there is a slight shift of pressure into the back leg on most times. So
there is.
That's and as you said, there's no tilting this way. Your head stays very centered, and there's no hip sway this way. It's more of an extension of the hip, which we'll get into later. But Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
the pressure shift is an interesting one as well. It's certainly in the golf coaching world. I think most amateurs don't care
Mm,
about pressure or weight, and some
mm,
coaches don't either, which is fine. I mean, the idea that the pressure moves to the right isn't something that Stack and Tilt have ever denied. If you go back and watch the 2.0 DVDs, which being 8 or 9 years old are still, in my opinion, some of the most detailed, most accurate kind of description of how a swing works. They use pressure plates in all of their filming of that. And at P3, which is halfway back on the backswing where the left arm's parallel, that's when the pressure is at its most to the right. And that's because the limbs, the joints, the two arms, which have a weight to them, and the
mm,
club is the furthest from the target. So there's a pressure shift for sure. Does teaching a 25 handicapper who's hitting 6 inches behind the ball every time he swings, it's telling him that there is a little bit of a pressure shift. We've got to keep the pressure shift in there. I mean, does that
mm.
help him? I don't think so. Telling him to put his weight more forward and teaching him how to keep his arms straight and hit the ground after the ball, that's what I'm interested in.
Mm.
It's priorities, and there's a different set of priorities, I guess, depending on the level of the student, but at its core, the fundamentals are true for every level of golfer. I've helped tour players and I help beginners, and the hierarchy in terms of the questions that you ask, certainly in my head, and how they're conforming to the fundamentals are the same regardless of their ability.
Yeah, and the rise of YouTube and social media and all coaches jumping out with all their videos and things. There is a lot of information on, left arm straight, right arm straight. It's not necessary to keep your arm straight. So a lot of things seems to go around in a circle. I feel it's a bit like fashion. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it isn't. So at the fundamental core of it, if you want to hit the ground or the ball at the same point every time, your left arm acts as a radius. So for those listening, if you're bending that radius, you have to manipulate something at the ball, and that's your timing aspect, isn't it? So the more you have to try and time it, the less opportunity you have to probably hit the same spot every time. So what we're talking about there is when you're beginning and wanting to hit that ground at the same point after the ball, by keeping that radius locked in, it's going to give you the best opportunity to do so.
Yeah, it's a foundation piece to start with, and the amount of that you'd give to someone would very much depend on their specific issue. But I certainly think poorer golfers demonstrate more flexed arms, and better golfers demonstrate more of a structured radius throughout the swing. Of course, the arms are bending; they're not dead straight. But again, does telling Mr. 25 handicapper that actually, although your left arm isn't completely straight, it needs to have like 6 degrees of flex in it. That conversation is ludicrous, right? They need to keep as much structure as possible. And then maybe take a bit out if somebody does overdo it, which is the rare occasion that somebody might overdo that instruction. But again, the feel and real, or understanding it well enough as a coach to then deliver it in a simple format to the golfer. And telling someone to keep their arms straight doesn't necessarily mean they're dead straight throughout the whole swing. But as a concept, for a lot of golfers, I would say thinking about having your arms straight when you hit the ball is better than thinking about keeping them soft.
Yeah, good
as a general rule.
The next myth: you need to fully convert to the method for it to work.
Well, I sort of touched on that a little bit, I think, hopefully, with the last answer when I said that it's not a method per se. It's really not. That's the misconception, because there is a swing that's been outlined, it's been clearly defined, it's been explained. But you're using that as a reference. You're not using that to teach everyone to do that. So no is the short answer. You do not have to adopt the whole swing in order to benefit from the pieces.
Yeah, I liken it to, Rob, I liken it to, I've just started learning the guitar. And, by myself on YouTube, right, don't judge me. But when I'm watching the YouTube, same song, different person, different strum pattern, maybe did a different way to go about it. Not exactly, but they come out sounding around the mark. So I think what you're trying to say is there is a limit. Well, within the method, there is things you can do that won't inhabit your ability at the end of the day. So there is a give and take around it. It's not just need to be perfect here, you need to be perfect there, you need to be 10% here, you need to, so I liken it to maybe learning something like a guitar where there's different ways to make the sound, but generally the sound's the same. It sounds like the song you're trying to play.
There is no need. Your question was, do you have to convert the whole way? The answer is no, because you can strike the ball better, you can hit the ball further, and you can hit the ball with more control by just adopting some of the pieces. And maybe it's just one piece, for someone who's quite an accomplished player already, but has this, one pressing issue, understanding one small piece, maybe it's set up or maybe it impact or whatever, that could transform their ball flight. That's what Andy and Mike were doing on tour when they were teaching on tour. They're not certainly helping players who are in the top whatever percent, 0.1% of golfers in the world. You're not rebuilding someone's swing on a Wednesday afternoon before they're about to tee it up. You're giving them a piece that's set up that will help to take a bit of hook out or help to put a bit of hook in or a bit of draw in, whatever it happens to be. So converting to the entire method is not necessary. If you look at the players who've worked with Andy and Mike over the years, you'll see that they don't all swing it the same. And that's unfortunately one of the brushes, I guess, that continues to sort of get tarred, stack until it gets tarred with, is that concept that it's just one way, and it's really not. If people take one thing from this chat, I'd like them to take away the fact that it's not one way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about Andy and Mike, that's Andy Plummer and Mike Bennett.
Correct. Andy Plummer and Mike Bennett.
Who come up with Stack and Tilt?
Yeah.
And is it an extension of the golfing machine? Is that what it is? Or is it, how is it related to that book?
Andy was a golfing machine instructor for sure. I guess in the time we've got here, I'm not sure I can go into the huge amount of detail, but it's a simplified, I would describe it as a simplified modern day version of the yellow book, which is the golfing machine. Mm-hmm. It's a more practical use of it. And it's, I think, also a more sophisticated study of the swing, which has more answers than the yellow book had. But I think the golfing machine was a fantastic publication, given how old it is and sort of what was going on in those days. You didn't have all the high-speed camera and radar and TrackMan and force plates and all that stuff. This guy's worked out. Homer Kelly, who wrote the book, has got a lot of things right a long time ago. And I think Andy Plummer gives a nice speech usually during his presentations at training, where he talks about building upon the people who've gone before you. And Andy would be the first person to acknowledge how much help he's had from people in the game as he was growing up through the golfing machine, his exposure to it with a guy called Tom Tomasello. That introduction that led to him meeting Mac O'Grady, the time he spent with Mac O'Grady. There's a story there that I think everybody has in their career, don't they? We've all been exposed to different people and different things at different times that take us on a journey. And, we're not responsible for creating any of this. And Andy would say the same to an extent. He's like, there's nothing really new under the sun. We're just presenting it in a way that they believe is more practical than some of the advice that had been out there for a very long time. I think you only got to go back 10 years and a lot of PGAs across the globe are still teaching sort of incorrect ball flight laws. The golf instruction has come a long way, and Andy and Mike, love it or hate it, I think their legacy will live on for a long time because it's influenced thousands and thousands of golf instructors. Whether they wear the badge or not, most people that you might look at in modern day golf instruction as being at the top of their game are very much either been around it, influenced by it, have been instructors at one time or another. So I think that speaks volumes.
Yeah, just to clarify, you're authorized instructor as well from Stack and Tilt. Just want to let people know that.
Yes.
So you talked about, you touched on technology. Um, has that just complemented or added to Stack and Tilt, and just defining a little bit more about what it is that is Stack and Tilt?
Yeah, from a ball flight point of view, it helps to evidence what you're saying, um, controlling the curve, building in the draw to the standard baseline shot because of where you place the ball position. The ball position is behind the center of the swing. It's more or less, for the sake of simplicity for people listening, is you put the ball more or less in the center of your stance to hit an iron shot. That, by definition of the geometry of how we're built, is behind the center of the swing. So there's an in-to-out path built into the setup of every golf swing, really. So that's where we say the draw is built in, and it's why the draw would be a more obvious shot to teach as a standard shot. I'm not saying for a second you can't play golf hitting the ball from left to right. You definitely can, and Stack and Tilt would help you to hit it left to right if you wanted to. But the most obvious shot to hit, because of the geometry and how we set up to the golf ball, the draw is built in. So you either hit that shot, or if you choose to not hit that shot, of course, that's fine. There's variation on that setup alignment, but the draw is there if anyone wants
that
to.
That was one of the other myths, is you can't hit a fade with the method. So how do you hit a fade then? You just is it a ball position thing? What is it you change in the method to hit a fade?
You've got different options, but you doesn't matter how you're swinging it. You hit a fade in the golfing world to make the ball curve from left to right as a right-handed golfer. You need to have the face open to the path. Okay, that doesn't matter whether you're calling it Stack and Tilt, whatever you're calling it, right? That's ball flight. So you need to have the face open to the path. When you set up, if, as described, you have the golf ball behind the center, there's somewhat of an in-to-out path built in relative to the target. So if you wanted to keep everything the same and make the ball curve from left to right, you could just open the club face at setup and have it so that the club face was now aligned to the right of your swing path. The problem with that particular description would be that if you didn't change where you aimed your body, that ball would now start to the right of your target and curve further to the right. So you could make that adjustment, but you'd also have to kind of pick up your entire setup and aim it to the left of the target. That's one way to do it.
Sounds pretty simple.
Yeah, I think at its core, the concept of that geometry is very simple. And in reality, we swing the club head and the sweet spot around our body, and we have to try and get back to the ball. And there's lots of permutations that go on during that swing, for sure. But you can definitely fade the ball. It's for sure you can fade it. It's not a draw only swing.
Oh, it's good to hear. And one of my other favorite ones that I've heard is you can't hit driver very long or high.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
It's again, you bring up one of those myths that does the rounds, and it's clearly in people's psyche because it does come up time and time again. It's a shame.
Do you think it's because people think that you're on the left-hand side, you can't get any power from your right-hand side? Is that where it comes from?
I think it's a combination of that. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think people think having your weight on your front foot means it's a steep swing, which is not correct. Those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand at all. So that's a misconception. That's often the piece that people get wrong when, if you hear someone say to you, I've tried doing this with my irons and I did really well, but I tried it with the driver and I didn't do so well. My immediate reaction and thought process when I hear someone say that is that they've sort of misunderstood the weight forward piece, but it's helped them with an iron because it's actually increased their angle of attack. It's helped them to hit down, whereas maybe before they weren't. So they've benefited from that point of view. But if they've continued that theory with the driver, that's not going to help them. Having your weight on your left side doesn't equal steep. That's the first point I'd make. To hit the ball far, you don't need to shift your weight. Okay, that's another point I would make. You can, and it is a piece that some would use to add power to their swing. But I think in the hierarchy of pieces I would choose in terms of their importance, shifting the weight would be way down the list. Okay, it wouldn't be in my top 10 of things that help to create power. So yes, it can help. Of course, you look, the arguments that are thrown at you are things like, the long drive guys, and his name escapes me now, but that dude with the long hair who rocks his feet backwards and forwards.
Oh, yeah. Is that Kyle? Kyle
Yeah,
Berkshire?
yeah. So yeah, it's awesome to watch, right? He's hitting it off a tee that's this high, okay? and he's got to hit a grid or a fairway that's about, I don't know how wide that thing is, but it's wide, and they get 10 chances to do it, and for the most part, they don't always hit that big wide target.
No. What do you reckon his percentage of 30-yard fairways is? 10% maybe?
Exactly. But this is why I think, coming back to the fundamentals, it helps to define the game of golf in the beginning. What do you need to do to be successful? You need to hit it far enough. Golf is not about hitting the ball as far as you possibly can with no consideration for the other pieces. That's lost on a lot of people. It's lost on a lot of golf instructors from what I see on internet forums and social media, because the modern day science that people are trying to throw at golf is really based around increasing clubhead speed, and that's purely because that's the easiest thing for them to study. So clubhead speed is the lowest hanging fruit. Let's study it. Let's talk about how pressure shifts, weight shifts, center of pressures, center of masses. Let's talk about how that influences club speed. That's all well and good, but just hitting it further or just swinging faster doesn't necessarily help someone to get better.
Yeah, and the stack and tilt methodology in terms of talking about power and speed, what is it that if I was to come to you and say, look, I'm playing second tier tours, I want to hit the ball further, how would you implement that in my game?
Well, very much depend on how you're doing it right now. So where do we start from, kind of what you bring to the table? If you weren't hitting it far enough, I would try and help you to understand where that came from. And that would be just through a study of your swing and having a look at what you do. But in the first instance, the first piece that creates power is depth to the golf swing, getting the hands far enough and the sweet spot far enough around you and behind you, because we play golf on a tilted angle. So that's the very first thing that brings power to the stroke. Swinging
you're talking about the further you can swing, that'll be the first lever in terms of power.
There would be a turning piece that definitely helps that. So rotation would be part of it for sure. But swinging on that inclined plane, one of the pictures that does the rounds on the internet, and we had it last week because of the match, or whatever it was called, the charity game with Rory,
yes,
Dustin, Matt Wolf, and Ricky,
yeah.
And
the other one's happening now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
the Tiger Mickelson one. Yep.
That's right. But this thing happens and pops up every 6 months or 12 months. There'll be a picture of 4 or 5 golfers at the top of their backswings with these vastly different looking backswings, under the guise that everyone's different, so nothing matters, kind of thing. Just go out there and keep swinging your swing. And how many coaches would have ruined Jim Furyk if he'd have come to them for a lesson? Well, first of all, I think it's a nonsensical argument. First of all, just bringing up the fact that the swings are different doesn't actually help anybody, doesn't give any degree of detail to why they're different, or if they're so different and it doesn't matter, why are you even bringing that up? That would be where I'd start. But secondly, look at the swing at P5 or P6, which for those listening is downswing positions, and you'll start to see a lot more commonalities than you will differences. And that's because every good golfer has to get that sweet spot of the club back onto some sort of functional arc or plane on the downswing. There is nobody, there's nobody swinging with the shaft coming down through their head on the downswing who's any good at the game.
Yep.
Jim Furyk might take it up with the shaft going up vertically through his head, but he doesn't bring it down like that. There's a reason he doesn't do that. There's a reason he does not do that. There is a reason that golfers do not do that if they're good.
You got to hit it out and not through the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So I think pointing out that picture and those type of pictures often, I guess, are thrown around around the idea that all golfers are different. Look at how unique we all are. The idea that we're all snowflakes and we're all individual. Yes, of course we are. I'm not debating that for a second. But the idea that then that would create no rules, no structure, no basic template in which to work from is ludicrous. Because if you didn't have a system in your mind of what to do, you'd never be able to help anybody. You wouldn't know where to start. You'd look at Mrs. Smith who comes in for a lesson and she's topping the ball or she's missing the ball. And if you have no system in your mind of how the swing works, where do you even start?
Yeah.
That would be my answer to these coaches who say, well, I teach the golfer in front of me. That's great. I hope everybody's teaching the golfer in front of them. I think we all do that. If we're not teaching the golfer in front of us, who are we teaching? And then if you want to push that conversation onto the next paragraph and say, well, why are you making that recommendation? Every golf coach would be trying to do their best job for sure. And then off the back of that motivation to help people, they're going to be making a recommendation based on their knowledge, their current knowledge, their experience of what's worked before. So everyone has a system in their mind of how this works. They just don't necessarily write it down, which is fine. Not everybody has to write it down, but don't pretend you don't have a system of teaching. That would be disingenuous, I think.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of Mrs. Smith coming to you, beginner golfer, you've taught her how to strike the ball first, and she's getting pretty consistent. The second part we're talking about is the power. How would you increase that in her? We started talking about getting the lever as long as wide as possible. From there, obviously making it efficient as well. How would you go about making that power so she can hit it up near the green somewhere?
Basic stuff without being too specific because you don't know what an individual's doing, but basic stuff would certainly be to allow golfers to turn their hips and change their knee flex. I think that's one in the backswing to help increase the turns. I think that that piece was one of the pieces that made Stack and Tilt initially stand out for being controversial. You don't have to do a lot of digging around of watching golf swings to see that that's actually quite commonplace and has been for years throughout history of golfers changing their knee flex, turning their hips. So that would be just a simple way of helping someone to increase their range of motion safely by utilizing their joints the way that they've designed to move, extending and flexing the knees, turning the pelvis, increasing the range of motion. So that would certainly be an obvious starting point to help somebody who's not hitting the ball very far. I mean, that's basic starting point. Where you go from there with someone would depend an awful lot on how they're loading the levers, the wrists, the arms. That's quite a complex puzzle that is difficult to get into on a general basis.
Yeah, I had the Aussie long drive champ I spoke to a couple of weeks back, and he spoke about the length of swing. So I've asked him, how you gonna try and increase your swing speed to get up to the world champ guys to compete with them, and he's talking all about the lever length.
Okay.
And also he talked about using the ground. Now, I'm not sure whether he knows that because he's for himself that it works, or he's hearing it from a coach. But how do you feel about using the ground as a term for power?
Yeah, I mean, we're all standing on the ground, and that can be used as a way to generate more speed. Absolutely. So yeah, I think it's a valid way to help people swing faster. Definitely.
But he did also say that he can't afford to not hit the middle of the club. Otherwise, it's a waste. So yeah. I think this is what we were talking about before.
I agree with that more for most golfers. Again, yeah. I think your filter that you look at this through, and obviously I'm looking at it through my own filter, it's very much influenced by the environment in which you teach, and the majority of the golfers, the level of the golfers that you work with as a sort of average. And it's going to be far more important for Mr. Jones to hit the center of the club face with his driver 9 times out of 10 than it is for him to swing 4 miles an hour faster.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the other misconception is going to your right side, back to your left side. I think for increasing power, that's just going to make it a lot more inefficient. Your as we talked about before, the club at its low point is going to be different every time. You're going to strike the club face different every time. And it's actually not good for your body as well, but we won't go into that. But in terms of stack and tilt, I feel you can keep the center by extending in the right side. And that's something I learned the most from seeing Andy was, Australian golf teaching has really taught in the past about getting to your right side. And I was always I'm still in flexion. And we talk about flexion being the spine sort of at that angle on your backswing for a right-hander. Sorry if you're watching on YouTube. Listening on the podcast. But your spine hasn't extended to the point where you're actually level and your head stayed still and you're centered to go for it. So by moving in flexion and trying to feel like you're getting power, it's just an inefficient move. And that's something that I was never taught as a player, as a coach at seminars. I was never talked about extending and tilting on the backswing. It was always about turning. Yeah. I heard turning. It was never about extending and tilting. And when you look at the spine, the best players in the world, the best ball strikers, do all three.
Without a doubt. I mean, every golfer's doing all three to an extent. They're just doing different amounts. So that's a really good point, I think you raised, Jake, because that, for me, looking at what Andy and Mike have done for the game, that will be their legacy, in the sense that nobody was speaking about tilting and extending and flexing and how the spine moves in 3 dimensions before they came along. That was the bit that they really described and helped me as a coach, you as a coach, and what you were just trying to describe there brilliantly was the extension flexion pieces. And as a coach, if you can see that, you can, I mean, we use motion measurement now here at GOLFTEC, and we're measuring what's happening in 3D. But I can see a lot of those pieces just in 2D because of what I learned from Andy and what to look for on a camera. First, like in terms of where that upper center is moving during the swing. Loss of inclination would be different tilting amounts, and that head moving from left to right would be different rates of extension and flexion. Knowing that is, I think, a vital component to understanding how golfers move and being able to then help them, because those movements will generally lead to certain patterns of path and ball striking and things like that. So being able to identify those patterns is the secret.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool on 2 levels. One level is, as I said before, the technology is complementing what those guys have talked about in 2D for a long time before this technology came through.
Yeah. And
the other thing, the coaches can utilize their camera in 2D without having to purchase that 3D equipment.
Yeah. Yeah, I was asked, a golf instructor friend of mine from Belgium sent me a message the other day. He's doing this study and he asked, he listed things A, B, C, D. He said, in your opinion, like, I'm doing a study, I want to know what pros think are the most important. And A was camera to be able to film the swing. I think B was like launch monitor, TrackMan. C was 3D like measurements, and 4 was force plates, like place them in order. And honestly, as long as I've got my phone with me and I can film a swing, I think I can really help somebody.
Yeah, that's a great.
The other things are just complementary and they sort of measure, but they're definitely not necessary for a good golf lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. I think technology is a pretty cool thing. It's great to find out some information about the swing. I mean, I'm a bit of a swing junkie too, don't get me wrong. But I know in my history of coaching and what I've learned, that is one of many, many aspects of getting that player to play their best golf. And that's what I want to bring that into now. The next part is stack and tilt is a methodology that coaches can use for their teaching, but it's not just about using swing to coach. So talk on, you're in an indoor facility and you're obviously coaching swings, but how do you then interpret that into playing on the course, and how do you share that with your clients?
Yeah, we have access to an outdoor facility as well. We definitely recognize the importance of getting outside. Golf is played outside. There are pros and cons to an indoor facility, I think. But you can definitely do a lot of good work in a controlled environment where you're able to dig down into the data, look at what the ball's doing, look at what the club's doing, look at what the body's doing. So people can practice. I think one of the biggest things we offer here is the ability for golfers to practice in an environment where they can really make some gains rather than maybe just going to the driving range and hitting balls. Being able to film your swing as you can here during your practice sessions is important, because you want that feedback to be able to know that you're doing what you were asked to do. I would say the biggest struggle that most golf coaches, certainly in my previous life of teaching the game, I think you'd always like to think that you helped someone during a session. Of course, there's always the odd one, but let's say you've helped someone hit the ball better, reduce their slice, whatever it might be. But when they come back, they maybe haven't retained as much as you'd have liked them to, or any of it for that matter. And that can be for a number of reasons. Some people just don't practice. But let's say someone does try to put the work in. If they're not able to film and look at what they do, then they're really just fumbling around in the dark. And so it becomes difficult from an amateur golfer's point of view to make significant, substantial change without supervised practice or good feedback. So for me, that's what the indoor environment here allows us to do. And it helps players to make technical changes faster. On the subject of helping them score better, I think also what they can do is sort of track their shot patterns more accurately. They can use the technology to see the sort of tendencies they have, the groupings they have for their different clubs. That can help them to make better decisions on the course, more realistic decisions in terms of aiming spots, more realistic decisions in terms of carry distances. They can use their own golf ball in the centre to actually get the true distance they hit their ball, rather than just a range ball or trying to guess by maybe lasering a target on the driving range. So I think there's a lot of practical applications to practicing indoors that you can then transfer outside. Short game and putting is a big part of what we do here as well. I'm a massive geek when it comes to putting. I'm a huge putting fanatic and fan in terms of teaching. So we teach mechanics, we teach green reading through the aim point system. We teach targeting and routine and just all the pieces that a golfer, again, would need to help them to putt better and take fewer strokes. And then, as I said, we do have access to outdoor space and a golf course. So as part of the process, you take someone to the course and see what they're doing. I think, again, I said earlier, you sort of see things through your own filter, and your own environment influences sort of what you do. In Singapore, we have some limitations in terms of the weather. It's ridiculously hot. So having an indoor facility to practice is a massive advantage, I think. Access to golf courses is difficult because the limitation in terms of number of golf courses here is a limitation that we have just in terms of capacity. Getting people out onto a golf course is difficult. So in an ideal world, that would be different for me. I'd like to see people on the golf course more often than I do, but it's just not feasible in this environment.
I love the idea of supervised, coaching, viewing their students practice. Supervising practice is I think the next big thing in coaching. I think I've seen a few guys start to do that around the place. I love that idea. Not only is it a lot more fun for the student to come out and do it with other people in the same category as them, learning the game, a lot more fun, but it is honestly not wasting any time when you're practicing, because so many people go out there and practice and sort of waste their time or waste their energy if they're actually trying to get better, because they might be just doing the wrong things. And so I think supervised practice is the next sort of thing to do.
I think it's a great thing for a lot of people, and it will almost certainly make it more cost effective for people as well, won't it? If
Absolutely.
you can figure a program where people can practice together, pay a monthly subscription to something, and that's a great model for the coach and for the student. Everyone wins then.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And, I want to get on to some tour players that have used it as well. And I noticed that Andy and Mike worked with several PGA Tour players. I'll just list a few. Aaron Badley, Mike Weir, Brad Faxon, Troy Madison, Charlie Wee, Steve Elkington, Dean Wilson, JJ Henry, and Grant Waite. So some of those guys have come and gone over the time, but even though they've left, they still don't have a bad thing to say about the time they've spent with Andy and Mike. And what I've noticed the most when they've talked about it was how simple it was. And I think, again, going back to the myths around stack and tilt being so complicated, and so that's something that is actually not true. It's very simple, especially when it comes from the guys that know so much about it. So they've got the ability to produce that simplicity. But I found that fascinating that they find it simple.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to that delivery level, like what you tell the person in front of you. You're not dumping all of your knowledge on that player. You're just looking at it as an expert coach. You're making a decision, and then you're figuring out the best way to get that message across to the player. And that can definitely be simple. I think, to the point of simplicity, the 10 words that I think you alluded to a little bit earlier and touched on.
So, yeah, it's simplified in 10 words. Weight forward, shoulder down, hands in, arms straight, and turn hips.
Tuck hips or push the hips forward.
Hips.
I think that is, for me, kind of a great way for people to just get introduced to the system without feeling overwhelmed. So the simplicity of that is genius, really, just to give people a starting point. And very often when I was coaching back in Portugal and making pictures for people at the end of their lessons and sending them their feedback, the top of the picture that I would make them would often just be 2 of those 10 words, or maybe 4 of those 10 words. So the lesson is diluted down to just a 2-word or a 4-word summary, even though during the lesson you may have talked about, if you're discussing shoulder down and the concept of the tilting, you may have gone into some detail during the lesson and helping a player enable them to do that, maybe through the changing of the knee flex or having a conversation about something to do with the anatomy and how they move. But at the end of it, you would want it to try and be just so my left shoulder moves down. Yeah, that's the feel. Shoulder down. Okay, great. Let's practice that. And so that's how a big piece of information can kind of be condensed into a digestible piece for the student.
Yeah. I want to go over those in more detail soon. I want to talk. Yeah, so with the guys like Grant Waite, for instance, he's won a tour event under the tuition as well. Aaron Badley won twice. I think is that the 2007? He nearly won a major. He was sort of back 9. He was leading before, unfortunately for Aussie fans, he didn't quite get it done. Mike Weir, I think, made top 20 in the world going to stack and tilt after being in the wilderness for a few years in between that Masters victory. So there's been a lot of success coming out of that. So what do you attribute to that success? What do you think these guys have done so well under the tutelage?
Because I think the information's good, and good information should lead to improvement as just a general kind of continuation. There's a logic there that if you get the right information and you apply it, it should make a difference. Of course, there's other factors in the world and in the human being that may stop that from always being the case. But that would be my most basic answer: is the information was good. That leads to confidence in the player. As far as each individual is concerned, they would talk about their experience. And I think you've alluded to the fact that no one really has a bad word to say, which is tantamount or testament to the relationship they had, and the fact that Andy and Mike helped everybody. Players leave coaches. It's just what happens, right? It's
Mm.
just the nature of the beast. The wheel keeps turning, and players leave. All coaches across the tour, best people considered to be the leading coaches on tour, people like Butch Harmon and David Ledbetter, lose players through their career. It's not necessarily a slight on their coaching, is it? It's just the reality of the evolution of a player, the evolution of a relationship. Golfers looking for another set of eyes. It's a complex puzzle. It's not as simple as saying, well, this guy's a great teacher, go and see him, he's going to make you better. But the fact that they all improved under the tutelage of Mike and Andy, I think, speaks volumes as well. I think anyone who criticizes their record with tour players needs to go and look at the facts, not listen to the haters, as it were.
Yeah, well, as you talked about the information, they have answers for everything, and that gives the player a lot of confidence. So, tour players are a little bit fickle, a little bit emotional at times, and it's a tough gig. I mean, you're working for yourself. There's a lot of money on the line. It costs a lot of money. It's an emotional sport, and players always want to feel like they want to get better, and they'll look for any out. They'll look for any out to get it. And sometimes, the coach is on the chopping block for that reason. It's just, chasing that dream, I guess.
Yeah, I think the driving range of a tour event can probably be quite an interesting place to be, and people speak and you hear such and such, and caddies probably speak. And if their player's struggling after having a 2 or 3 week run of poor form, people talk and people are looking. I think we're always trying to get better, aren't we? Sometimes to the detriment, a golfer will say that they make a move and they don't necessarily improve. And there's certainly stories throughout golfing history where players have tried to remodel their swing, change what they do, having been successful and actually not managed to find that form again. So it's a really tough call to make when it's your living. You want to maximize your winning and earning potential, but sometimes that decision can go wrong.
So who's your favorite sort of swing on tour? Who do you like looking at, or who's your bottle that you like to use a lot?
I guess modern swings, there's a lot I like. There's a couple that just popped into my head when you asked the question. Rory, I think it's a lot I like in Rory's swing. I think it's improved a lot over the last 12 to 18 months. Tommy Fleetwood has a nice move. Justin Rose, I thought, had made a lot of progress as well in recent years with his swing. So there's a few there that I really kind of like watching. There'd be 3 that I'd pick out as being good.
What particular about them did you like? The flow, the power, the efficiency? What do you like about them?
Yeah, I think Rory's in full flow with the driver. I think Rory's pretty spectacular to watch. Fleetwood, I kind of like the structure of his swing, the centeredness, the tilts, the arms, the finish. There's a lot of what looks very efficient there, and I think that just looks good to my eye. So it sort of fits in with what I like to see. And similar with Rose, really, I think his swings evolved significantly over the years, and maybe a year or so ago, it was really good. I've noticed, I actually watched him here in Singapore in January when he was over for the Singapore Open and filmed a bit. And there's bits now that probably aren't quite as nice as I'd like to see. But again, he still, or was in that instance anyway, performing pretty well. So, you don't want to get too lost in the swing. Like, there's so much more to a player's performance than just their swing. And when we're talking at that level, there's fine lines and fine margins, right? I think the golf swing conversation, you have to remember who you're kind of talking about and the detail in which you might critique a Justin Rose swing, and the things that you have a conversation with the coach about, and maybe pick out 1 or 2 pieces you're not quite so happy with. Doesn't mean that if Justin Rose walked into you for a lesson, you'd necessarily kind of try and redo everything. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So just from an aesthetic point of view, I just like the flow of those swings, and the geometry fits my eye nicely, the tilting, the structure.
Yeah. Well, Justin Rose is an interesting case study because he's had the same coach through the whole time. So you see his progression. I'm pretty sure he's got the same coach to this day, right?
I do not know, but I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting itself. Like, as you said, he's made good progress. I think he used to even say to himself, he used to flip down the bottom a little bit. He used to get his hands involved, come out high around his head. And over time, he's really exited left and controlled the club face rotation, which is, as you alluded to before, pretty cool to watch. A lot more tilt in it. And he has he lost that a little bit? Has he gone back to a little bit more of that?
Yeah, a couple of things I filmed on the course in January where it's a bit more like that, and he seemed to be struggling to control the driver. Like you say, it is interesting that the evolution isn't continuously improving. You sort of hit bumps in the road. And maybe that's for a number of reasons. Maybe he's stopped practicing a particular thing that was helping him. Maybe he has a different belief about direction to go, or maybe it's nothing to do with any of those things, and he's just spent more time working on his putting and maybe not as much time on here. And you just don't know. But golf swings that don't look how I like them to look can still be extremely functional. So my hat's off to Justin Rose and his improvement over the years. And I just like watching him because he's a Englishman and seems like a really nice guy as well.
Yeah. He's one of the guys I like to listen to when he's talking, or he has a bit of fun out there as well, which is good to watch. So no, I agree. Justin, I hope he wins more and he gets back out there and starts performing again. I think he just left his manufacturing agreement.
Yeah,
too.
I saw that this week. Yeah, he's like that Homna relationship, which was about just over 12 months. So it'd be interesting to see where he goes.
There's another example, isn't it? The fickleness of the tour, because I think he started like a house on fire with them. And so, you know, so, okay, it can't be the equipment. So then, okay, well, that's come into my life. It's now associated with bad. I've got to get rid of it.
Yeah. And Homna's a brand in Asia that probably there's a bit more exposure for. So, you know, we were trying to get them to put it in here and have access to it because I think there's a bit more demand. But that was interesting, as you say, you know, started great with it. Now, 12 months down the line, it's sort of gone sour. There is another example of the complexity of the puzzle that is a PGA Tour player, and in his example, one of the best in the world still falls foul potentially of equipment changes, or mentally might just start questioning the equipment change, even if it's not the equipment change, and he's looking for a change to make in his game that gives him a bit of a boost, you know. So
that's why we love and hate the game, don't we?
Well, it's never ending, right? It's fascinating that people like that work with a coach, as you say, all the time, and yet their swings are always evolving, you know. So long term, I think it's one of the things GOLFTEC does really well is that consistent sequential process of lessons and practice that they encourage their students to do. Like, make golf something that you do regularly, and both through that repetition of good coaching and good practice, you make significant or substantial change over a period of time. And that's really the way that anyone gets better at anything, isn't it?
Yeah, and you got to keep onto it because, as you said, I think we have tendencies. Just like as a kid growing up, you hit a lot of balls as a youngster. Whether it's in education, whether it's in golf, you have a tendency, and I feel that's the same with a golf swing. So, unless you on top of that, and if that tendency is the thing that's, you know, your kryptonite, so to speak, like we talked about Justin Rose flipping. You got to keep onto it. Otherwise, it can creep back in, as you mentioned, because under pressure, or if you're not confident enough, you tend to do something that's way back in that mind and brain, and it comes out.
Yeah. Like you say, it's the reason we love it, and the reason we hate it is it's so difficult when we're struggling, and it feels so effortless when we're doing well. And it's searching for that flow and that freedom that you have when the game's going well that is the carrot that everyone's constantly chasing.
Yeah, I remember when I used to play a lot, I remember thinking if I had a bad day, I couldn't wait to get out here tomorrow because it's a new day, new opportunities, new swing feel I could try and get. It was an exciting time. So I couldn't, even if I hit it good or hit it bad or played bad, I couldn't wait for the next round to see what I could do or what could happen. And
Yeah,
yeah, it's a cool game that way.
it is. It is. I think coming full circle really, and coming back around to the idea of having a system and understanding of how it all fits together, you are absolutely less likely to get knocked off track if you can see the logic and the steps that you're working towards in order to achieve something. I think certainly as a younger golfer and a sort of aspiring professional who didn't take a lot of coaching and didn't really know how the swing worked, to your point about tinkering, I do think that I would try anything over a period of time. If I was struggling, I'd try this, and I'd try this, and I'd try this. Before you know it, you're off down some rabbit hole that you can't get out of. And I had some pretty low moments as well as high moments in terms of playing, where even as an expert golfer, you don't feel like you can keep it on the planet or on the golf course, which is not a great place to be either. So
No.
I think that forged a lot of my desire as a coach to understand how it works better, just so that I could hopefully stop people having to sort of go through that trial and error kind of figure it out on their own methodology, if you like, versus having some structure.
I wanted to finish, mate, with the 10 words. It's basically trying to give an online little introduction to maybe a player that's just starting or someone who wants to improve. And I think these 10 words are a pretty cool starting point. So part of the stack and tilt, obviously the stack means wait forward, I'm assuming. So that's the first 2 words, wait forward. And that's what the stack is?
The stack would refer to the centeredness of the backswing, I think.
Okay.
But the weight is moving forward progressively on the downswing. And when we say weight, simply refers to the fact that when you make contact with the ball, you want most of your weight to be on your forward leg. And that would be, again, uniformly demonstrated by every good player. There's nobody playing the game to any decent level who's got their weight on their back foot when they're hitting the ball. So weight forward being the first 2 words is just trying to help somebody understand that. Specifically going into it a little bit more detail, weight forward is really describing the pelvis and how the hips are moving forwards. So one of the misconceptions sometimes, or one of the pieces that gets overdone or misunderstood on the backswing, it's like the head and everything moving forwards. Okay, that's not what it is. It's a very centered pivot from a front-on view, and then from down the line, from the downswing, the pelvis would move forwards, while the upper center would stay centered. So it's a weight forward swing with the hips.
So more of it's like a slide, a little slide.
Yeah, definitely. To change that left tilt into a right tilt as you swing through, there's a hip slide, which again there's slide in every good player. Some players can do too much of it. Some players do less of it. That's the piece that you could, change and use to influence someone's path or someone's contact, for sure. So I'm not saying there has to be an exact amount, but there is an exact amount in the model if you wanted to maintain your centers and maintain your inclination to the ground. So the slide exists, and that's important that people do know that. You should not be trying to not slide.
So at impact, 70-80% on your front leg is ideal.
Yeah.
Okay. The second one is shoulder down. So that's referring to obviously backswing.
And follow through. It's the tilt element. It's the fact that we play golf on a tilted angle. Mm-hmm. So on the backswing, your shoulders are going to tilt to the left, and on the follow through, your shoulders would tilt to the right. So shoulder down is a basic describing the tilt. You maintain your inclination to the ground. So as a golfer, when you set up in some kind of forward bend, and you have this inclination with your spine, let's call it that. A lot of people would say it's your posture, but more accurately, it would be describing how the tilt helps you to maintain your inclination to the ground. And changing the tilt as it does throughout the entire swing You have to blend that with the right amount of extension, flexion, and rotation to maintain that inclination.
So,
That's the
okay,
hypothesis. That is the
right.
hypothesis of stack and tilt. You asked me
Mhm.
earlier, kind of what is it? It's a swing that from the front view has a centered axis or pivot with the upper center and the lower center moving forward. And from down the line, it's a swing where you maintain your inclination to the ground.
And that's important, the inclination for hitting the ball on a descending blow.
Yeah, you would say, well, you would also, I would argue that it's a more repeatable motion rather than changing your inclination throughout the swing, which would be like bobbing up and down or coming out of your posture. I would say that that's more complicated, difficult to do. And again, just on the shoulder down question or point, going back to my photograph of all those players at P4 with Jim Furyk, Matt Kuchar, and everybody else in between, if you wanted to pick out the commonalities in those pictures that would actually help golfers rather than just tell them that everybody's different, one of the most common pieces there is that they're all tilted to the left with their shoulders, their hips, and the knees have changed flex. So if you wanted to start looking at things that you could tell people to do that were more similar and a commonality of great players, I would say the shoulder down piece defines golf. It's the playing on a tilted angle. That's how we have to hit the ball that's down there on the ground. So you have to tilt to the ground. That defines the game of golf.
Yeah, I would challenge people that see those pictures to cut out their hands, the players' hands and arms, and actually have a look at how dissimilar they are or similar they are. So I think you'll find that there's a lot more similarities.
Yeah, and I think, again, just going back to that picture, pointing out that everybody's different isn't helping anybody. I mean, what's it telling poor old Mr. Brown this time, right? We're going to keep working our way through names. Yeah, he's sitting there watching that telecast or that social media post or whatever it happens to be, and the coach is saying, or the commentator saying, look at all these swings, aren't they so different? Just how unique everybody is. And this guy is represented by thousands and thousands of golfers who are struggling, sitting there watching this or reading this and thinking to himself, well, yeah, but my swing, my loopy swing or my funky looking swing doesn't work. I'm a 28 handicapper and I keep taking lessons or I'm trying to get better. And yet this thing that you're telling me is so unique about me is my snowflake principle is making me a 28 handicapper. It's not making me a good golfer. So that argument, again, sort of gets me going, and you can probably tell it kind of I get a little bit animated when it comes to talking about that because I just think it's not helping golfers. And as coaches,
yes, that's right,
undoubtedly at our core, every single person is trying to help the person in front of them get better. So just telling someone that swings are unique is kind of pointless in my opinion.
Well, that's right. And when, as a coach, you're looking through the impact area, and if the impact area is out, then you got to work on it, don't you? So we're looking for a commonality in the impact zone, and all good players that, like, just before impact, around impact, very, very similar.
Yeah,
I
think
strokers.
If you showed those 4 players and you took a picture of them at P6 where the shaft's parallel to the ground on the downswing and posted that picture, then you'd start to see a lot more similarities. In fact, there was a really nice video that Nick Clearwater did, who's the vice president of teaching for GOLFTEC globally, based in Denver. And Nick did a really nice sort of a video analysis of those 4 swings and talked about why they're different at P4 and the top of the backswing, and then started to move through the swing and to look at really things that golfers could take from that analysis would be useful for them. So if anyone is interested in that, that's on GOLFTEC's YouTube channel. It's a nice conversation that he did with Corey Walker, which I think summarizes that picture and kind of backs it up with some actual interesting information that some golfers could find useful.
Very, very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, that explains that very well. The hands in is the next 2 words.
Just again, describing the fact that we play on this tilted angle. So there needs to be some depth to the hand path at some point. Now, of course, there are plenty of golfers who've played the game whose hand path going back is more straight. But as I touched on earlier, it's not straight when they're swinging back into the ball. So hands in is the concept that you have to have some depth to the hand path. And again, if you were starting someone from scratch, or you were trying to help someone who struggled, particularly slicers, I see a lot of slicers who have these sort of very vertical hand paths. Telling someone to turn their hands in or swing their hands inwards or around them is the concept of swinging on a tilted angle. And that would be the same for the follow through as well. So the hands moving the right amount in versus swinging out too far or swinging across too much. So hands in is really just like a reference for the arc of the swing.
And I wouldn't know any coach on the planet that would get Jim Furyk as a kid and teach him what he did. So, obviously there's a point where students or kids that play the game have got a repeatable motion that they've hit ball after ball after ball without being told anything. But I can't imagine a coach actually just prescribing that to a new player.
No, I think almost once you've got a player in front of you who's so competent that their ball striking is that good, you're really looking at fundamental number 3, which is that controlling the curve piece, which is the bit that varies from week to week. Mostly is the bit that varies from week to week on tour. No one on tour is hitting it fat all of a sudden. They don't just start hitting 6 inches behind the ball, and they don't just start topping the ball, right? So you're not dealing with fundamental number 1 with a tour player. You've got a player in front of you already who is competent at fundamental number 1. There's a threshold on tour of distance, clubhead speed, and if they're on tour, they certainly meet that threshold. That doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't do better to hit it more distance, because clearly that is a massive advantage on tour. But you're dealing with a Jim Furyk example. You're helping him manage his face-to-path relationship, helping him control the distance he hits his balls and the dispersion of those shots. That's something that you could do if you implemented the system. You wouldn't start them from scratch. As I said, you wouldn't start telling Jim Furyk to swing his hands in on the backswing. Hopefully.
Depends how many balls he's got, I guess. I don't think he's got another 10 years to work on it though. The next one, arm straight. So I think we alluded to that a little bit earlier. So that's just referring to the radius of the swing.
Exactly. It's just giving a general instruction that keeping the arm straight and the swing having some sort of structure and radius to it is more beneficial than whenever these arms start to flex and you start changing that radius. I think that's definitely something I see among poor golfers struggling to maintain that, and better players demonstrate the opposite. They demonstrate straighter arms. So it's not arms straight in the sense that you literally keep them completely straight, but it's the concept of it giving the structure to and the consistency to the radius and ultimately the contact.
And to help keep that radius, I think the last one is tuck hips. So just go into the tuck hip part as well.
That's really talking about the extension on the follow through. So pushing the hips forward this way.
Yeah.
And creating the extension in the spine.
What's important about that?
Well, it's a power piece for sure. So it definitely helps with creating more speed. One of the studies that GOLFTEC have done using their motion measurement was on that finish position with the shoulder bend. We call it shoulder bend at GOLFTEC. And the sensor that's on the top of the spine there would measure how much you're bent forwards or backwards. And there was a very direct connection and correlation between handicap and amount of forward bend and back bend. So the back bend seen in elite players, PGA Tour, at the end of the swing would be 32 degrees back. And in the poorest players, it would be like 0.
All right.
And the more forward you stay flexed with your upper body, the more that encourages your arms to bend on the way through.
Yeah.
So it's a really important piece. The trouble with that piece, though, you can't teach someone to extend and tuck their hips on the follow through if they've got their weight too far back, because they will top the ball. You have to have the bottom of the swing far enough forwards by virtue of having the hips far enough forwards, you have to have the low point far enough forwards before you can start to extend up on the follow through. If you have the weight back and you try to extend, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons so many golfers struggle with that follow through is because their weight's back. The only way they can hit the ball with any degree of function is to stay in forward bend as they swing through.
Right.
Because they've got the weight too far back to reach the ball, they have to start swinging across and staying in forward bend, and their follow through of a higher handicap golfer starts to look a lot more like this. Whereas an elite golfer gets the weight forwards and then from there can push up, use the ground, to your point about using the ground for power, and start extending the body backwards, which is like a catapult sort of motion.
Yeah, cool. So just to finish with this, I wanted you to give just one little drill, if you could, for anyone listening struggling with their ball striking. Is there one little drill you could get them to do over the next month to help their ball striking?
If they're outside, it's very easy to go to grass. If you can go to grass and scratch a line in the grass, just scratch a line with your foot or with your club and put that line in the center of your stance. Address the line with your club head. So you start with your club head on the line, and then make swings where you try to hit the ground target side of that line. Right. That would be a very simple drill where you could actually start to recognize where your low point is occurring. So as you implement that drill, you'll start to recognize, am I hitting the ground at all? Am I hitting the ground every time I swing, or am I missing it sometimes? And if I do hit the ground, where do I hit it, and how consistent and tight is that spot on the ground, or how spread out is it? Because for me, that's actually almost a very direct measure of someone's handicap. You can almost have a pretty good guess at someone's golfing ability by their ability to do or not do that drill successfully. So if you or I stood there, and we don't practice, well, I don't practice, I don't know about you, Jake, but I don't practice.
No,
but I could stand there. I could stand there and scratch a line on the ground, and I could stand there all day and never hit behind the line. And I would always hit target side of the line, and the dispersion of the divot or the contact point on the ground would be very, very small. That helps to define me as a decent player. Right? I can make good contact. Fundamental number one.
Yeah.
The poorest player, if you gave them that drill, you asked them to make 10 swings, they'd have 10 very different looking contacts. Some would hit the ground, some wouldn't. They'd hit the most back on the ground. Then they'd have a variety of kind of divots between that backward point and the line. And the poorest players would never hit in front of the line. They would never do it. So just start with that drill to get a benchmark of where you're actually at. And if you recognize a deficiency there, that's maybe something you'd want to talk to your coach about.
Yeah, absolutely. And where do we find you then? So you're in Singapore, and where's GOLFTEC over there?
Yeah, we're right in the center of the city in Raffles Place. So, but we can't operate until I think July is looking like when we're going to be back. So we've got another month, unfortunately. So if anybody would like some online help, they can go to my website, which is robcheneygolf.com. There's some online lesson stuff there that I'd be happy to help with over the next few weeks. Keep me out of mischief and point you in the right direction if you're looking to improve your swing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend that people follow that up, follow the information on Stack and Tilt. There's obviously a website as well, isn't there? A Stack and Tilt website people can...
There is, yeah, there is. And that has an instructor locator on it as well. So you may find in your part of the world someone close to you. But as I just said, if not, there's a lot of instructors offering online tuition. So that you can access it via that website, or if you want to come direct to me, you can access it via mine.
Look, thanks so much for your time, Rob. I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure people listening and viewing will as well. So I really appreciate your time. Good luck in lockdown. Hopefully get back out there soon and start coaching people.
Thanks, Jake. I really appreciate you having me on, and yeah, stay safe and take care. And hopefully I'll see you in Oz in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. Come down. I'd love to have you down here, mate, in Melbourne.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Rob.